Let's move to Arwa Damon. Arwa was with us earlier in the week, award-winning journalist who has spent much of her career covering this region, covering the Middle East. And, that was the story of the day. I want to talk about Gaza itself and what's happening, because you have the particular experience, as we're showing on the screen there, that I'm going to play part of that or read part of that in a moment. But the other way first, the images that the Secretary of State was shown are getting a lot of attention inside of Israel today. They're getting a lot of attention here today in the United States. But what would you say about the power of imagery as it flies around the world in a situation like this?
It's extraordinarily powerful, Connell. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. And it's going to generate some very, very powerful emotions during what is already an explosively emotional situation, and understandably so. The danger that we face, though, is that war requires us to dehumanize the other. And we humans have a habit of trying to address a deep and egregious wrong by, in turn, acting out a deep and egregious wrong, as if that is somehow going to lead us down a better path. We need to be very, very careful in how, on the one hand, yes, we express our horror. We feel the bile rise in our throat at seeing some of these, images that are coming out, but that should not allow us to then dehumanize an entire population. And right now, this goes for everybody across the board. We're at a very, very dangerous juncture here right now when you allow emotions to just fly freely, and when we react purely based on those emotions, we risk very gravely dehumanizing each other, and that's not going to serve anyone's purposes at this stage.
All right, to that point, let me talk about what you wrote about what's happening inside of Gaza, this experience of the doctor in the Atlantic Council. Here's the headline: Gaza under siege, a doctor recounts the humanitarian cost of war. But I want to read from the piece, and then you could add to it. Parents try to keep their children calm and distract them, but what can they do when it's not just the bombs that echo through the streets, but also the sounds of the chaos between airstrikes? While many of Gaza's residents were not surprised, at the same time, they are horrified by some of the apathy towards their suffering. They are not Hamas. The vast majority of them do not even support Hamas. Pick that up.
Well, and this really goes to the crux of it, right? The issue here is not Israel's right to respond. The issue here is Israel's historic responses being those of collective punishment. And right now, what we're seeing when it comes to the collective punishment of the people of Gaza is not just this intense bombing. And when we talk about the chaos between the bombings, what we're talking about is the sounds of the crumbling of buildings. What we're talking about is the screams of those in pain, the screams of those who have just realized that someone who they love is lost. What we're also talking about here is this complete and total siege that has been implemented by the Israeli government. And what that right now looks like, what that is creating, is a severe humanitarian shortage of fuel. We already know that Gaza is completely in the dark. The main power plant there is not working. And what this fuel shortage then does right now is that means that the generators that things like hospitals are trying to run on are eventually going to run out of fuel. That means that medical equipment that's needed to keep people alive, that's needed for all those in the ICU, that's not going to be able to run. The great concern of the people of Gaza is not so much living in the physical darkness, but it's also that stage when they get to the communication darkness.
Right.
When what is going to happen to them is going to be happening in this complete and total void.
You had us, as a last point, the last time you were on with us, you were talking, I think it was a friend of yours or somebody you know in Gaza. They were, as people do, they're packing a go bag and trying to get out. Is there any, that was a few days ago, was that person successful, or is it the same situation?
She managed to actually get to a hotel where right now there are a number of Gaza residents who are also sheltering. It's worth mentioning that for other residents, they're trying to go to UN buildings, UN schools to try to shelter there. But again, they're also impacted by the lack of humanitarian supplies coming in, because the UN itself, without fuel, can't run its desalinization plants that it has pre-positioned at some of these schools. There are great concerns about the fuel. Just to go back to the doctor who I wrote about in that piece, the main hospital that he's working at, they are concerned that they could actually run out of fuel in the next 3 days. And that is just going to create a nightmare of proportions that we have not seen. We have actually not seen this type of a siege on a population in, I want to say, decades. Even when ISIS had Mosul under siege, basic supplies were getting in.
Arwa, you have a lot of experience covering this region. We appreciate your perspective. We'll continue to check back with you. Arwa Damon in Istanbul today, but it's covered this particular.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find News Nation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.